Okay, so we should be live now. So thank you to everyone who's joined already. We're going to be getting started with the webinar very shortly, but we're just going to give it a few more seconds to for people to jump on and get set up in the room. So bear with us. We just see a few more names joining and then we'll get started. Okay, well, we've reached 6:01 or 7:01, depending on where you're located in the world. So thank you so much for all tuning in and joining us in this webinar. We're hosting it between the teams of Dills Lucas Fox, Lumon, and Mortgage Direct. So we're here to answer your questions around property, purchase in Spain, currency exchange, and mortgages, of course. So we're going to be taking you through what we're calling the 7-step property purchasing journey. We've broken it down into these 7 steps for you. These are specifically the steps for international buyers in Spain. So we're going to be looking at what to expect in the process, timelines, and any costs involved. So if you could switch to the next slide, Nicole. So just as a quick introduction of ourselves, I'm Amanda. I work with Dills Lucas Fox. I take care of strategic partnerships as well as prime properties across the country for Dills Lucas Fox. On a personal note, I moved from the US to the UK over to Barcelona around 12 or 13 years ago and have never looked back. So this has now become home. Over to Nicole for your introduction.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nicole. I've been helping people transfer currency for property purchases and sales for the last 10 years. Lumon itself has recently celebrated 25 years of trading and has helped many thousands of people moving money in and around of Spain with buyers from the US, UK, and all over the world. So over to you, Kevin.
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Munger, one of the co-founders of Mortgage Direct. We're one of the largest mortgage brokers in Spain. Later this month, we'll celebrate our 20th anniversary, so we're not in the business quite as long as Lumon, but not far behind. And we have more than 30 advisors who deal with international buyers. We also have a team that's dedicated to locals. They're based in Madrid. Our brokers that deal with the international clients are spread around Spain. We also have a dedicated team that deals with high net worth clients and ultra high net worth clients.
Perfect, thank you, Kevin. So if we jump to the next slide, again, we're going to be walking you through the property purchase steps. At the end of our presentation, we'll definitely have time for questions and answers. We have quite a few questions as well that some of you have already submitted. So we'll definitely be taking time to answer those. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to be walking you through these 7 steps. So I'll be taking you through anything property related. So we're going to start with selecting the right real estate agency. Kevin's going to take you through the mortgage pre-assessment, Nicole through currency exchange and planning, and then moving on to a few more of the property steps, finding your property, signing the arras contract. Back to Kevin for the formal mortgage offer, and then I'll explain what completion day looks like when you're buying this property. Over to the next slide. So the very first step is, of course, selecting the right real estate agency. So if you've joined us here because you've received an invite from Dills Lucas Fox because maybe you sent an inquiry in the past, then you're off to a really good start. Spain has over 3,000 registered agencies across the country and hundreds more of independent workers who could be potentially selling you a property. The reason for this is the barrier to become an agent or an agency is quite low, and that means you don't really know who you're getting in touch with or what level of training or experience this person or this agency has. So for example, everyone knows Idealista these days. It's where you can find most of the properties in the market. If you go there, you will find many properties, but you're also going to be sending out a lot of inquiries to a lot of different agencies, and you won't know much information about them. So for example, how much experience does that person have? How wide is their portfolio? What support do they have behind them? by selecting at least an agency and one with a good reputation, you're tapping into a professional structure, a trained agent supported by their directors and their colleagues, as well as a legal team, and for example, in the case with Lucas Fox, a dedicated KYC officer behind all this structure as well. So once you get in touch with an agency, you'll be able to brief your agent with the key details. And when we say key details, we're not just talking about how many bedrooms you would like to have in your property or which location it's in, but we want to know even more context about what you're looking for. What is your timeline? Do you need a mortgage to be able to move forward? What sort of lifestyle are you seeking? So it's really in-depth conversation in which you can brief your agent. At this point, your agent should be able to pull together a short list of properties within a couple of days from this wide portfolio that we have access to here at Lucas Fox. At this point, there's no costs, nor do you have to pay as a buyer, except in two cases. One is that you're hiring a buyer's agent specifically, but this is something that you would specifically request and sign again a specific contract for. Or if you're buying in Valencia, sometimes the commission fee, which is normally elsewhere paid by the seller, it sometimes is split between the seller and the buyer. At this point, if you feel quite confident that you are going to be moving forward with your property purchase, even if you haven't found the property yet, it would be highly recommended to find a lawyer already, because this person can be given power of attorney and they can help you with taking out your NIE, opening your bank account, and so on. On to the next slide, Kevin's going to walk you through the mortgage pre-assessment.
So in the mortgage process, the very first step would be that we would receive the direct contact from the client themselves, or quite often we would get the client's details from one of our collaborators. Once one of our advisors receives those details, they will organize to speak to the client. In some cases, they might send a link to an online form which the client can complete at in their own time. Or if the client prefers, they can have a phone call with one of our advisors, or nowadays it's quite common to have a video call, which is great because this wasn't really something that was widely available or people were thinking of doing prior to the pandemic. But since the pandemic, it's become very common to have a video call with a mortgage advisor. I think it helps to create trust, and our advisors are very open to doing video calls. So once the advisor is speaking to the client or receives the information online from the client, they will be aiming to assess that information. The key information that we as mortgage advisors require will be, first and foremost, what is the amount of deposit you have? So what is the cash that you have that you want to put down on the property? This will be the part that is not covered by the mortgage, obviously. And also we'll need to know what cash you have to cover the costs for the purchase and for the mortgage. It's important to know that in Spain, you can't roll those costs into the financing. So there will be a maximum loan to value according to your profile. You need to cover the difference between that maximum mortgage amount and the purchase price, and then also the fees and taxes on top. Another thing that we'll obviously need to know about is your income. Here in Spain, they use what's called a debt to income ratio. They'll ask this is the banks, they'll ask for what income you're earning on a monthly basis. This can be your basic salary, any bonuses, commissions you might earn, and any other types of income that you might have. It might be a pension, could be rental income, and so on. We also need to know what your monthly debts are. Monthly debts would be what are actual debts, so mortgage amounts that are paid on a monthly basis, any personal loans you might have with banks, any car loans. If you have credit card debt, the banks will want to know what your total amount of credit is with those cards, what's being carried forward month to month. So if you have a charge card, or you spend on your credit card each month and then pay it off in full, that means that there won't be anything to declare in terms of credit card debt and monthly payments. But if you do carry forward balances, the banks, the lenders will calculate a monthly amount that they'll include in with your monthly debts that I've already mentioned. Credit history. So the bank will want to know, do you have any black marks on your credit file? You will need to provide a credit report from your home country if you go further into the process. This is just the initial stage here, so what our advisor will request from you and what's important for us to be able to prepare the quotes. And then finally, we'll ask you to confirm the property details. So ideally for that, it would be good for us to know, have you identified a property already? If not, when will you be looking to buy? And also what mortgage amount you need. So you might tell us, I want to buy a property around 500,000 if you haven't identified one, or you might say, I've found a property, the asking price is 600, haven't agreed the final price yet, but it's going to be around about that level, and I need to borrow X% of that amount. Once we have all the information from you, we will then provide you with a minimum 3 quotes if it's possible. It's not always possible in Spain, depending on what the client's requirements are, but the law requires us to provide a minimum of 3 quotes where we can. The timeline for providing you with those quotes, we're saying here 2 to 5 working days, or it could be quicker or might take slightly longer depending on the complexity of the profile. Are there any costs for this initial assessment? No, there's absolutely no fee, and also no obligation to proceed with our company. We provide all that information and those quotes free of charge. On to the next slide, Nicole.
Yep, so this is for currency exchange planning. So currency exchange may be the last thing you think about when you're planning to purchase a property abroad, but this can actually have a huge impact of the purchase cost of the property. If the exchange rate was to fluctuate between reserving the property and completion, would you still be able to afford the property? So we've seen rates in the last year move from 119.50 to 114.45 in 2 months, from the end of May to the end of July, which means a 500,000 euro property would have cost you £18,500 more. If you're moving dollars, similarly, we've also seen a considerable movement in the last year. So we saw a high of 0.97 in February to a low of 0.83 in January this year. So within a year, that would have been a massive $87,000 increase on a 500,000 euro property. Regardless of this movement, we are still helping people move dollars because this may continue to drop, unfortunately. But to help prevent this, we can help discuss all of your options from when you are viewing properties. So once you have registered, you'd be allocated a dedicated account manager to help you. They will discuss with you different types of contracts, such as forward contracts or limit orders, which can help you hedge your risk against the volatile currency markets. So a forward contract is where you can lock in today's exchange rate for a future date based on a 10% deposit. And a limit order is where you can tell us your target exchange rate. And if this is achieved, we would automatically exchange the funds. We can also set rate alerts for you, which is similar to a limit order, but we notify you that your target level has been reached, so you can decide if you'd like to exchange any funds. You can also hedge your risk by transferring in stages rather than one lump sum to get an average rate rather than transferring everything at one time. And once you find a property, you may have to pay your reservation fee the same day or quite quickly. So it is best to have the Lumon account set up before this, so everything is set up and ready to go. So the account is free to set up and there is no obligation to use the account. And your account manager will then be able to help exchange the funds for the deposit and the completion, and will be able to send funds directly to the solicitor, which would prevent you from receiving any bank charges. If you did find a property unexpectedly and you hadn't had an account set up, we can set up a Lumon account and send funds within the same day if needed. Just need to get in contact as soon as possible. At the moment, everyone is focused on what is happening in the world, and it is causing a lot of volatility in the currency markets. So since the 27th of February, the rate has actually improved for doing pounds to euros from 113.50 to 115. So if it was on a 500,000 euro house, this would now cost you about £5,750 less within 2 weeks. So you can see the difference it's going to make on your property. It is still a great time, obviously, to be looking for your lovely sunny getaway, and you do have the option to lock in a forward contract if you're not quite ready to transfer the funds. At this moment in time, unfortunately, no one can tell you what's going to happen in the future. But with the current events, we cannot predict the outcome. So we have these options to help hedge your risk and lock in the rate for you. When we look forward in the market, we look at forecasts of 6 major banks. At the moment, 3 of those are forecasting higher rates and 3 of them are forecasting lower, which just shows how volatile the market is at the moment. And back to Amanda.
Thank you. So as Nicole mentioned, what's really important is that you're taking care of these steps with applying for your mortgage and with setting up your currency exchange account, and apart from these 2, getting your lawyer in place as well, because you want to, let's say, get all these plates spinning at the same time so that when you do identify your ideal property, you're ready to go ahead and you can meet the timelines that are expected at that point. So at this point, in terms of timing, you'll be setting up your team and you'll be speaking with your agent in terms of the short list of properties that you would be interested in. It's really in your hands to a certain extent at this point in terms of how long this stage can take. We've had clients who do 1 visit and close on the same day. We've had others who can take years searching for exactly the property that they have in mind. On average, you could say someone who is searching with intent could find their property within about 3 months. That's quite standard. Or if we had to put a number of visits on it, it may be around 8 property visits from which you'll decide to go ahead with one of those properties. On top of that, obviously, if you're based abroad, then there's your decision making around whether you're comfortable doing virtual visits or whether you'll be coming to visit in person. So if you're going to come and visit in person, you can of course create your shortlist, but it's going to be very reactive to what's happening on the market. The properties here can absolutely fly. So you may have one on the list and then you don't visit for 2 months and it may be gone by then. So of course, being able to choose a property if you want to visit in person is going to depend on how frequently you can come and visit Spain as well. Once you do find a property that you like and you want to move forward with it, the following steps will be happening. You're going to have a conversation with your agent to agree that you want to put an offer on the property and at what price. Once you agree on what your offer will be, your agent will help to write a formal offer letter and you'll send Lucas Fox a 1% deposit. Then the negotiations start between you, the agent, and the seller. If the seller accepts your offer, then that 1% payment goes towards the purchase of the property. If eventually they don't accept your offer, then it's refunded back to you. This whole process really depends on the complexity of the property and of the negotiations. You could send the formal offer letter in 1 day and receive a response immediately, or it could take a few days, maybe up to a week. Perhaps in some cases it's going to extend beyond that, but I think that would be quite a special case. Then, after a few days or whenever the negotiation has been agreed, again, the seller decides to move forward, your 1% deposit then stays with the company. Then the agent will gather all the paperwork from this property and send it to you and your lawyer to do the due diligence and review all the details. On the next slide, if you could skip forward, Nicole. So this is where the process becomes more time sensitive, especially if you're taking a mortgage. Once your offer is accepted, your real estate agent is going to start preparing an arras contract. So this outlines the conditions and it requires a non-refundable 10% deposit. Saying that, there's one situation that's quite common, or one clause that's quite common to put into these arras contracts to be able to cancel the offer, and that's a clause around your mortgage. If you're going to be taking out a mortgage, you can include a clause that says if you are not able to secure your mortgage, you're able to cancel your arras contract and receive your 10% back. If that clause is not in there, then you're not protected and you could potentially lose that 10%. Furthermore, because of steps that Kevin will explain later, when you're creating your arras contract, you also want to put a closing date, probably of up to around 3 months from the current date. And that's to allow enough time for your mortgage to come through. Then, so your lawyer will receive the arras contract, as will you. You'll review it. You'll confirm it's all okay. You'll be able to sign it and pay the 10% deposit. At this point, you're probably also going to be paying 50% of your legal fees, with the rest due at closing. So we're going to go to the next slide and back over to Kevin to talk about the next step in the mortgage process.
So referring back to the original slide that I dealt with, so our advisor would have sent, hopefully, a minimum of 3 quotes to the client after having had their details. Then, if the client wishes to proceed, so I'll remind you that up to that point, there were no fees payable and no obligation to proceed. But having received those 3 quotes, if the client does want to proceed with Mortgage Direct, we would then request that they sign our intermediation agreement and also pay the first fee that we charge directly to the client. That amount, €795, is the typical amount. It can vary sometimes depending on the complexity of the situation, but the typical fee is €795. Once we receive the signed intermediation agreement and that payment, we're ready to start the formal application process. So what does that mean? That means that we will send you, first and foremost, we'll confirm which lenders it was. So in the quote stage, we would have said option 1, 2, 3, and listed out exactly what the mortgage conditions were for each of those options. And then the client may say, well, option 1 is my preferred option, but I'm also interested in applying formally for both options 2 and 3. So we would confirm which lenders those options related to and provide the application forms, either for the client to complete themselves. Sometimes clients, it actually is faster for the client to go off and do that themselves, or some of our advisors prefer to take control, organize another phone call to go through each form with the client. It depends. Each client has their own kind of preferences. So we send off those application forms once they've been completed, and then we have to wait for each lender to come back either with a formal approval. Sometimes they might come back with questions. They would also ask us to send the documentation. So we would request that the clients send us all the documents that would be required. So that will be the typical things that you would need even for a mortgage application in your home country. So we're thinking about your payslips, your fiscal declarations, so your latest tax returns, your bank statements, the credit report, which I mentioned when I was going through the first slide, your IDs, passport. You would need to have an NIE to complete the purchase, but it's not always essential at the very beginning of applying for a mortgage. However, it is with some of the banks. So when you've spoken to a lawyer and you've signed up with a lawyer, part of the thing that they can do for you usually is obtain a NIE number. This can be quite problematical sometimes in Spain, especially if you're buying in places like Barcelona. There are quite a long sort of process or time to get your NIE number, which is the national identification number for a foreigner. But there are now companies that can do this service for you, and it's much faster. So they can obtain a NIE number for you in a week or 2 weeks, whereas if you wait to go through a lawyer, sometimes it can take longer. Once we send off the applications with all the supporting documentation, as I said, we wait for the banks to come back. Sometimes it could be that they immediately confirm that the mortgage is approved. More often than not, they'll come back with a series of questions, things that they need clarifications on. Sometimes they might require additional documentation that isn't in the standard checklist. Obviously, that would depend on the client's profile, how complicated it is. If it's a self-employed client with businesses, often there'll be more documents that the bank will require. Quite often they'll ask for the last 3 years of fiscal declarations for the company or the annual reports. Sometimes they might ask for the bank statements for each company that the person might own. We might have a self-employed client that is a sole trader, or they don't have a company, they work for themselves as a freelance, or whatever that situation might be, they will ask for all documentation you could possibly imagine in some cases to check out that what you've put on the application form can be proven with the backup documentation. So once we get those decisions or extra requests from the bank, the objective will be that we would get to the point where each of the banks will approve the mortgage, whatever that percentage will be. Once they do that, provided that what they approve is no worse than what we've quoted in our quotes, we would then require that you pay the second direct fee, which is 0.75% of the amount that the bank approves. And we do quite a lot of research. In Spain, it's very common for credit intermediaries, mortgage brokers, to charge fees to the clients. We know that it isn't in some countries, but here in Spain, it most definitely is. And once we receive that initial fee, the initial approval fee, we would then start the next stages of the process. Typically, that will be to open a bank account with the preferred bank. So you would tell us that as the client, fantastic, well done Mortgage Direct, you've got me an offer which matches exactly what you quoted, and that's with my preferred lender. So I'm ready to go ahead and open a bank account. And after we open the bank account, we will then instruct the valuation. Sometimes we can instruct the valuation much earlier in the process if needs be. So we might have a client that has a very specific bank that they want to go with, and we know that they need to act very quickly. They've got a tight deadline. As Amanda mentioned, we normally advise clients to allow 3 months when they sign the ARAS contract. Usually we can get the mortgage offer in place and everything ready to be signed within that 3 months, but sometimes due to circumstances beyond our control, there might be some issues with the property that we weren't aware of, or there can be a number of different things. Complexity of the client's profile means that the bank requests more and more documents, and it takes time for the client to get hold of those documents. So there can be different reasons which slow the process down, but we would say normally allowing 3 months in the ARAS contract is adequate. And if there's a problem with the property, normally the onus then is actually on the seller to resolve that. And if it is in that case, the 3 month period can be extended because it's down to the seller to get that property into the position whereby it can be mortgaged. Obviously, having a mortgage and having a valuation, it gives you that extra protection that you wouldn't have if you were a cash buyer. So the bank doesn't want to lend you money to buy a property that they're not happy with. There might be illegalities or certain things that they're not comfortable with that they want you to resolve before they'll allow you to go and sign the mortgage deed at the notary. So that does provide an additional protection, as I say, that you wouldn't have if you were a cash buyer. So we've opened a bank account. Some cases we may not have done that at this point, but we will instruct the valuation. As a mortgage broker, we work with multiple different valuation companies. We will select, if you want to have us recommend one of the companies that we recommend, then we would be very happy to do that, obviously, and that is something that we prefer to have control over rather than leaving it in the hands of the banks. We're not saying that the banks are doing anything bad, but we know that it's quicker, and we know that we get better results, and we can have conversations off the record with the valuers. If there is some issue, we can get it resolved quickly, and it just gives the client themselves more control over that very important part of the process. And by law these days, the buyer of the property, the borrower, has the legal right to do that, to request a valuation directly with a valuation company. Once we get the valuation back, provided that there's no issues with it and the value of the property is at or higher than the purchase price, then we're ready to move to the next stage. If the valuation comes back lower, then we may have a problem. It depends. If a client wants to borrow the maximum possible and the value comes in less than the purchase price that they've agreed, then we may need to engage in some back and forth with the valuation company to see if there's any way that they can increase that value. That usually happens before we've even discussed with the bank that we've got the report. We don't normally disclose to the bank that it's lower than the price until we've really exhausted those conversations with the valuation company, because often in Spain there can be things there can be some movement speaking to the companies. It's quite a complex software program that they all use, and sometimes it depends on the value of themselves and their expertise to get a higher value. And we are working with who we consider to be the top valuers with the best knowledge of those systems in Spain. So all being well with the valuation, the bank would receive that from us. They'd have the bank account open, and then we're ready to plan to go to the notary. So what the bank would then do is release what they call the final binding offer, which in Spain is called the FEIN. That is the only point in the process where the conditions of the mortgage are crystallized or guaranteed, if you like. They are the binding conditions. Prior to that, when you get the initial approval, those conditions are not guaranteed, but usually, unless there's something happening in the market which would lead the bank to want to either increase the rate, or in some cases, they may be willing to reduce the rate, for example. They don't normally allow those conditions at the start of the process to be fixed, but once you get the FEIN, that's when they are definitely fixed by law. So once you have the FEIN, you'll sign that documentation, and in Spain now there's what we call a cooling off period, a reflection period. It varies. In Catalonia it's 2 weeks, other parts of Spain it's around 10 or 11 working days. That period of time has to pass before you are legally allowed to go and sign the mortgage deed at the notary. Also, prior to that, you yourself in person, or you can do a power of attorney to appoint a lawyer to do this, a minimum of 24 hours before you're going to go to the notary to sign the mortgage deed. You have to attend the notary and you have to complete a test. That test is to show that you, as the borrower, understand the conditions that you've been presented with in the FEIN, the binding offer. Once you've got through that process, 24 hours must pass, and then you are legally allowed to go and sign at the notary. When you receive the FEIN and you've signed it, it gets registered on what we call a notarial platform. So your lawyer, you get the legal right to choose the notary office you want to use, and it gets registered on the notarial platform using the contact details of your chosen notary. What's the timeline to go from starting the formal process to being able to go to the notary? So you've signed the FEIN, you've completed the test to show your knowledge of the conditions. We would say normally around 8 weeks. It can be done quicker, as I mentioned earlier. To do the process as quickly as possible, we sometimes have to recommend to the client, we need to select the option you prefer now, and we need to do the valuation prior to you receiving the initial mortgage offer. That's quite often the only way to complete in less than 8 weeks. It could be done, I would say, probably around 6 weeks if we do that process. The reason for that is when you instruct a valuation, the valuer, number one, they have to be available. They have to reach out to the person that's going to show them to the property, because by law in Spain, they have to physically visit the property. And then it takes time for them to prepare their report and for that to go through their internal approval procedures. And it can depend on the time of year. When we get to July, for example, all the banks are starting to slow down because August is a holiday month. Usually at the end of the year, things slow down as well because the Christmas period, and in Spain, it can be 3-4 weeks because the celebrations are on different days. And so 8 weeks is just a guide, really. It can be less, according to how I've described, or it can sometimes be more. You hit these bumps in the road with the property, or the banks, it's a struggle to get the approvals due to complexity of profile and so on and so forth. But I would say 8 to 10 weeks is probably a good time frame to have in mind. The costs, I've already mentioned, the initial cost, which is once you want to start the formal process. And then we have the second fee, 0.75%, which is once we've got the formal approvals, provided that they're in line with the quotes. Valuation fees, so the client has to pay mortgage broker fees, any bank fees, and the valuation fee. This is on the mortgage side, so the costs for the property are separate. All I'm describing here are the costs directly associated with financing. a valuation fee. So let's imagine an 800,000 property. The valuation fee there would be between 500 and 700 as an example. Might be slightly more, could be slightly less. And the higher the price of the property, the higher the value of the property, the more you're going to pay as the valuation fee. Bank fees, now these range from 0, and a lot of the banks in Spain now are charging 0 as the bank fee to the client. This is a one-off fee, so it's not ongoing fees that you pay to the lender. This is what you pay on the day of completion, and just prior to the completion, your lawyer will be involved speaking to the bank, and they will work out, usually with a gestoria, who's a type of administrator, they'll work out the cost breakdown. That will be for the property costs as well as the mortgage costs, and that they will have worked out with the bank what are the costs going to be. And like I say, a lot of the banks in Spain are charging 0% to the clients now, and they're doing that to be competitive. So several of the largest lenders in Spain charge 0, and a lot of those other lenders have followed suit in order to remain competitive. I think that covers my slide. So next one, Nicole.
Okay. Back over to me. So you've made it to closing day and you've got, let's say, all your ducks in a row and everything's all approved to move forward. As Kevin mentioned, you're able as the buyer to choose the notary that you want to sign in. So you'll choose the notary office, set the date, and on the date when you go in person to sign, there's going to be you as the buyer, there's going to be the seller, any lawyers involved, if you've taken out a mortgage, your bank representative, and of course the notary. The notary will read through the document, confirm that everyone is aligned on all the details of the seller, the buyer, the property, etc. And the bank representative will be able to do the transfers to the seller or the sellers, and all the fees will be paid immediately on site. If that person's not present because you don't have a mortgage, then you can make the payments, but your lawyers will be there, or your lawyer will be there to guide you through that process. So at this point, in terms of purchasing costs, you have your ITP tax, which is 10%. Overall, it does depend per region, but we say to calculate on top of the property price about 11 to 12%, which is going to include the taxes, the notaries, lawyers, etc. That's the rate for Catalonia, which is the highest in Spain, so the other regions might fall a little lower than that. And then, unless you've agreed otherwise, you'll be handed the keys on site and everything's done. The house is yours. The agency can help, or sorry, the agent can help to transfer all the utilities to your name, and so on. So this wraps up the 7-step process. We will go into answering a few questions now. Nicole, if you could just flip to the next slide. So we have a few questions for each of us, which we can spend approximately the next 10-15 minutes running through. So the first question is for Nicole. It's, how do I move money from the US, both to purchase a property and for monthly expenses like electricity, alarm system, mortgage payments, etc.?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. So once you have a Lumon account, you'd be able to transfer your dollars to the Lumon dollar bank details that we provide to you. You can do this for your main transfer to purchase the property, but also any ongoing payments such as mortgage payments, electricity, etc. You'd be able to provide your Euro bank details for the payments to be sent to, and if you have any direct debits set up to your Euro account, you can send that through. Your dedicated account manager would be able to help with any questions you may have about sending that across.
Perfect, thank you. So the next question is for me. Are there any additional costs for foreigners buying in Spain? Very short answer, no. There's no obligatory additional costs for foreigners that want to buy in Spain. Spain has been receiving and encouraging foreign buyers for a long time now, and it's a very open country to foreign buyers at this point. The only, let's say, potentially additional cost you may be looking at is if you do decide to hire a team around you, which perhaps a local person might not need. So that might be financial advisors, a lawyer, and other additional advisors and brokers. The next question is for Kevin. Are there any age limitations for mortgages for people over 65 years of age?
The short answer is yes. All banks will have a maximum age, and here in Spain, typically speaking, it's between 70 and 75, although we do work with two lenders who are two of the largest banks in Spain, actually, that can go up to age 80, but that is the absolute maximum. And in order to qualify for a mortgage up to 75 or even 70 to be fair, so from 70 to 80, you will need to be able to demonstrate your income during those years, which obviously for most people that's going to be a pension, and that's exactly what the banks will want to know about. So American clients, they'll need to show their retirement accounts, same as for European clients as well, and quite often they'll ask for evidence. So they'll ask for potentially a document from the state social security pension office to see what the projected pension is for you. And if you've got a company pension scheme, they'll want to see the value of the pot as it is now. It could be linked to your salary, so they'll want to see all the details of those pensions. Sometimes we do have clients who apply whilst they're already not in retirement age, but let's say they're post age 60, for example. So they're approaching what would be the normal retirement age in the countries where they live. In some cases, the banks can be flexible. For example, if they are directors in a company, they might assume, for example, that they could go on to work until they're 70 in the same kind of role. Or if they're self-employed with their own businesses, quite often banks can be persuaded that somebody is not intending to sell their business or stop working in their business. And so there can be a little bit of flexibility around that. But generally speaking, when somebody is in an employed position, they will assume that they're going to retire at the normal retirement age, and that will be for everybody in that role. And therefore, as I've mentioned, they'll want to see evidence of what your income will be at that point. We don't understand, or we don't have visibility on exactly how the banks do their calculations, but we know, for example, that some cases will be where they look at the client's profile. They could see, for example, that they're going to have all their debts paid off. They might already be paid off, but they can see that the client could be debt-free in a few years' time, and that can affect the calculations in terms of the affordability. Do they think that that person will be able to afford to continue to pay the monthly payments after they get past the normal retirement age? Hopefully that's answered that question.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. So the next question is for me. What are the general costs associated with buying or owning a property? So as I just mentioned in the last slide, when you're buying, you're going to have buying fees of approximately 12%. Again, this is specific to Catalonia, but this is where the rates are the highest. So you'll be looking at slightly lower figures for the other regions. You might also have community fees depending on what property you're buying. So to give a very general idea, if you have a 1 million euro property with a few common spaces and an elevator and so on, you might be looking at community fees of about 250 euros a month. Saying that if you decide to buy in a new build project, or especially a branded residence, or one with a lot of amenities, a lot of services, obviously that number is going to be creeping higher and higher. I'd say in terms of the absolute maximum, the really high-end luxury community fees, then you'd be looking at perhaps up to 2,000 per month, but this is really going for the highest end branded residence, full services type of property that you could find. And then you have what's called the EB tax. This is also region dependent, but again, if we're looking at Catalonia, which I think a lot of you were interested in the Barcelona, Costa Brava, Girona, etc. regions, for a 1 million euro property, you're looking at, very roughly speaking, EB of about 1,500 euros per year. So next question is for Nicole. What's the difference between Lumon and 100% online banks such as N26?
Yes, so there's a lot of online banks that may offer a quick and easy online service only. It may seem great to begin with, but what happens if something doesn't go quite right? So we've seen so many clients where their funds get stuck with compliance or the bank, and they're not able to speak to anybody to resolve the issues. And these clients often come back to a service like ours, like Lumon, because they prefer a personal service. So you will have a dedicated account manager to provide this personalized service. So they'll guide you through the markets, through strategy, and much of this is conducted over the phone, and that is really to understand your requirements. We also utilize different options such as limit orders and forward contracts to help you mitigate risks, which some of these other companies online don't offer. We do have local bank accounts in Spain and across Europe to help avoid bank charges or receiving fees. And we do guarantee no banking charges for payments being sent to the solicitor. And we've got a proven track record for successfully managing these payments.
Perfect, thank you. So next question for Kevin. Are there any nationalities or currencies or countries where people are resident that banks prefer to lend to?
Yes, is the short answer again. So back in 2019, the Spanish mortgage market was regulated for the first time in history, or the only time in history. And the Bank of Spain, in their wisdom, decided that they would have a new rule, which meant that somebody who didn't have their earnings or their home currency as euros, they would have the right, after they sign the mortgage, if their home currency dropped by more than 20% against the euro, they had the right, and have the right, to convert the mortgage from a euro mortgage into one in their home currency. So let's assume you have an American client, they sign a mortgage here in Spain, and the dollar drops by more than 20% against the euro. Legally, that client can convert their euro mortgage with a Spanish bank here in Spain against a Spanish property denominated in euros. They can convert that euro mortgage to one in dollars. At the time of the new legislation, the banks reacted quite negatively, or very negatively, to this, and they said, well, that's a risk that we've never had before, and quite frankly, we're not willing to accept it. So as a result of that, most of the banks said, we'll only work with clients that are earning in, and it was a basket of currencies. So US dollar, perfectly acceptable. Virtually all the banks will lend to somebody earning in US dollars. Pounds is accepted as well. Swiss francs, the Scandinavian currencies, also Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar. There are the more obscure currencies where the banks simply won't lend. So for example, the Chinese currency, the Japanese yen, Thai baht, just to give a few extreme examples. So, but there are banks that will lend to people earning in Singapore dollars, Emirati dirhams, Saudi riyals, for example. What you need to do is, when you speak to your advisor, obviously you'll tell them during the first call or when you fill out the form what your currency of earnings is. If you're earning in a currency which the banks don't accept, there are some ways around it by setting up a Spanish limited company and then applying for the mortgage through that company. Or you might have somebody that lives in a South American country, for example, but they get paid in US dollars. That is accepted to the banks as well. But if you're earning in an obscure currency and you're not willing to set up a company to buy the property, then I'm afraid in this day and age in Spain, due to the legislation, it's going to be impossible to offer you a mortgage.
Okay, thank you. There are a few property questions. I realize there's quite a few questions, so thanks for sticking with us. I'm going to run through a few more. The next couple of questions are for me, so I'll just go through them quickly. What is normally contained within the Arras contract? So this is a legally binding contract which outlines all the information relating to the sale. It will talk about the property, it will name the seller, the buyer, their bank accounts, it ensures the property is debt-free, and so on. As a reminder, the, let's say, get out free clause attached to the mortgage is not necessarily automatically included. So if this is relevant for you, just ask your lawyer to double check if that can be placed into the contract. The next question is, what sort of protection does the buyer need to have in place before buying? For example, an attorney, an architect, and so on. So I would definitely recommend to set yourself up with a strong team. You want to make sure that you have a very knowledgeable and experienced agent, and they can definitely recommend you a lawyer. You'll of course want your mortgage broker and your currency exchange provider. In certain cases, you may benefit from a financial advisor as well, especially if you're coming from the US, where the tax situation can be a little bit more complex. There are definitely benefits to having at least a consultation and seeing if it's interesting for you. Then somebody asked, can I repeat the 3 kinds of contracts? So yes, you start with the formal offer letter. That's when you first want to show your intent to place your offer on the table. If that gets accepted, then you're going to be signing the Arras contract, ARRAS, and that's the legally binding contract where you leave the 10% deposit. And then if that all goes through, you get to the closing date and you're going to be signing in the notary's office the Escritura de Compraventa. So those are the 3 contracts. And we have time for a couple of more questions. So this one is for Kevin. What would be the typical differences between the mortgage quotes other than the rate?
So typical differences, you could be looking at the loan to values. Obviously, that's a very important thing. Not all banks will offer 70%, for example. So 70% for many, many years has been the maximum that's available to foreign buyers. There is one lender we work with nowadays that will go up to 75, but that's a very new thing. And some of the banks will only go to 60% if you're, for example, not earning in euros. So that's a major thing that could differ on the quotes that we send. The term, so some banks prefer a 20-year term. Other banks are more flexible and are happy to go to a 25-year term. Some banks, if they look at your age, they might be saying, we'll only do 10 years or 15 years. Other things, the early repayment penalties. Some banks have 0 as their early repayment penalties. Others use the maximum early repayment penalty that they can in Spain, which depends on whether you've got a variable rate mortgage or a fixed rate mortgage, and how soon after you sign the mortgage do you pay it off. I think they're really the main things that differ on the quotes, apart from the interest rates, of course.
Perfect, okay. Then the next question is, can we receive a recording of this webinar after it concludes? Yes, absolutely. You'll receive a recording of the webinar, and we also normally try and follow up with everyone individually, especially if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, then we'll be in touch to be able to answer it directly with you. Then the next question is, where does the exchange deposit go? To which bank? I believe that should say. So I believe you're talking about when the Arras is paid, and that can sometimes go to the seller, or it will sit with the agency itself to hold that deposit in case it needs to be returned. One point I didn't mention is, if the buyer decides to cancel after signing the Arras, then they would lose that 10% deposit. If the seller decides to cancel after the Arras contract has been signed, they lose that deposit and the double to the buyer. Next question, and I think we're going to have to wrap up on this one, but will the information we're presenting in the meeting today be available afterwards? Yes, again, we'll send you the recording. We can send you the presentation as well, and we'll be reaching out to you. But of course, anytime you have any questions relating to property, currency, or mortgages, please feel welcome to reach out to us. You can always be put in touch with an agent who can talk you through this process and keep it more specific to your case as well. I know there was another question with regards to tax, but just because that's such a specific question with regards to your circumstance as well as the region that you'd be buying in, that's not something we'd be able to answer live, but again, we'd be able to help you either in a one-to-one call or by putting you in touch with a tax advisor. So again, we'll reach out to discuss that in more detail. So on that note, we're gonna wrap up for tonight. Thank you so much for joining. I hope it's been really informative and useful for you all, and looking forward to seeing you in the next webinar.